For 5 years, between 1952 and 1957, the CIA conducted a covert operation to pierce the Iron Curtain and rout the USSR. From bases across West Germany, they launched hundreds of thousands of specialized balloons over the airspace of Soviet-controlled Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. But these weaponized balloons were not armed with missiles or mines or incendiary devices. They were laden with a far more dangerous artillery, weapons designed to sway the tide of war by combating lies and infecting minds. They were filled with fiction. Specifically, they bombarded enemy territory with millions of copies of George Orwell's Animal Farm. And the CIA had good reason to believe that this literary payload would leave a deeper impression than any conventional weapon could. Animal Farm has proven to be among the most powerfully persuasive allegories in recent history. It tells the tale of a neglected collection of farm animals rebelling against their heartless human master. Under the leadership of a wise pig called Old Major, they follow their successful revolution with a common resolution to institute a new society, assuring equality, dignity, and liberty for all. But in time, after Old Major's demise, the rest of the swine bicker and battle for power. Eventually, a shrewd pig called Napoleon ousts his competition and takes control. He trains a division of vicious dogs to carry out his bidding. He forces false confessions from geese and sheep, and then he holds their public executions. He leads by instilling fear in the farm and filling the minds of the animals with lies. Ultimately, he and his piggish enablers arrange a meeting with neighboring human farmers, plotting to generate profit for the pigs at the expense of their lesser barnyard peers. And those so-called lesser animals hear of the meeting, gather outside, and peer through the window. And the last line of the book cements its standing as a classic work of colossal power. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. And great endings make mere words on a page resonate in ways that transcend time and penetrate the mind, enabling a book to break through its binding and shape the spirit of an age. Sometimes endings can become rote or ritual, as per the fairy tales conventional "they lived happily ever after," or the customary presidential coda, "God bless the United States of America." But even those that are rote can show the power of an ending to provoke dread or stoke hate or sow hope. It was the literary critic Frank Kermode who wrote most notably about the psychology beneath the human need for an effective finale, what he called the sense of an ending, which brings us all today to the end of Genesis. We have gone from the dawn of time and the first light to the sight of 12 united Hebrew tribes. We have read of floods and towers, of abuses of power and the rebirth of faith and forgiveness and family. We have met angels and seen dreams and encountered the kings and priests of the ancient Near East. And some of the most fundamental concepts in religious history have been read over these last 12 weeks. We have read the sentences responsible for launching a revolution in human rights, in opposing tyranny and promoting the sanctity of life. And we've seen faith construed as a rejection of fate and a commitment to embrace responsibility. And yet, the end of Genesis, the very last sentence, in fact, the very last word, leaves us perplexed and perturbed. This morning we read, Vayamot Yosef ben Me'ah be'eser shanim. Joseph died at 110 years of age. Yechantu oto, he was embalmed. V'yisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, and placed in a casket in Egypt. Full stop, period, end of book. And this is my question. For weeks now, since he was thrown in a pit and sold as a slave, Joseph has been in Egypt. So why on earth does this last verse expend its very last word and end this profound work with something so patently obvious? Even if it wasn't the last word, the very end of Genesis, it would be an extraordinarily unnecessary fact to tell us that Joseph was laid to rest in Egypt. And the fact that it is the end of Genesis only deepens the question. When endings can make a book's best case, when grand finales can cement a story's place in our psyche and shape societies and history, why does Genesis end this way? Why, after pages and pages of incomparably evocative, consummately provocative, relentlessly prescient, revolutionary narrative, does the narrator seem to falter at the final hurdle? After 50 chapters of philosophical complexity, moral depth, dramatic suspense, and aesthetic invention, what are we to make of this great and sacred text? Seemingly pedestrian, repetitive, even artless end. And perhaps this last sentence at the end of Genesis proves the whole point of the book. Perhaps it is not pedestrian or repetitive, but demonstrates the central thesis of Genesis and justifies the need for the book that we will start to read next week. While some have suggested that the whole purpose of Genesis is to prove that God gave the Jews the land of Israel, the breadth and scope and content of the text itself seems to preclude that possibility. For many, it is quite clear that the whole book of Genesis is actually about proving one fundamental, incontrovertible human truth. We cannot live and flourish without faith and the rule of law. The first 11 chapters showcase a trail of human failures from murder and theft to neglect and oppression. Without the revelation of laws, if left to our own devices, we live by violence and are led by desire. And then the next 39 chapters show that slowly, very slowly, a single family inspired by the divine can over time breed a sense of unity and piety and a vision of tribes rooted in mutual commitment and common decency. And read this way, Genesis seems to end on an intently positive note. The book closes with the ancient equivalent of, and they all lived happily ever after. Egypt is the ancient Near East's economic, political, and cultural powerhouse. Fueled by the Nile, targeted by spies, it lies at the heart of civilization, capable of saving the wider population from famine and mass starvation. Egypt is the America of old. It is the place where talent and patience can take you from rags to riches, the place where dreams can come true. And despite the fact that Joseph hails from a small, foreign, nomadic family, he has risen through the ranks from slave to inmate to interpreter to prime minister in a single sentence. He made it. He overcame prejudice, he overcame animus, and he proved that in Egypt, peace and dignity and freedom and prosperity are possible. When the text says, V'yamot Yosef, Joseph died, v'yisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, and he was laid to rest in Egypt, it is not a repetitive recording of a geographic fact. It is the staggering climax of 50 chapters that tell a dramatic human story that Joseph, an outsider, an immigrant, a child of an itinerant shepherd, was interred with honors, not just anywhere, but in Egypt. And read this way, the end of Genesis seems to moderate its thesis. There is no need for a social heavenly revelation. There is no need for the rule of law, because in Egypt, under the rule of a benevolent emperor, even a Hebrew slave can make it. And for a whole week, we are left thinking that the case is closed. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. But we all know that the Egyptian dream was short lived, that precisely where utopia seemed possible, where Pharaoh gave a Hebrew slave freedom and a name and power, It took less than a generation for free Hebrews to be enslaved, disgraced, and made to cower beneath the boot of a ruthless dictator. The end of Genesis is thus the most powerful proof of its original fundamental claim. It may take us a week to see it, and it may have taken our ancestors a few decades to feel it, but without the rule of law, without a commitment in faith, everything hangs on the whims of a king and the mood of a nation. Though it is true that Joseph was interred with honors in Egypt, Vayisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, in no time at all. V'ya'avinu Mitzrayim, et b'nei Yisrael b'farech, Egypt enslaved Jacob's children with malice. And all it took was one small, predictable, and inevitable thing: a new king. Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim. The first monarch to emancipate the Jews of Europe was Emperor Joseph II of Austria in 1782. He repealed anti-Semitic tax laws, rescinded prejudicial labor laws, revoked discriminatory criminal laws, and he pledged that the Jewish nation would be placed on a footing of near equality. What was called the Edict of Tolerance was hailed as a stunning and heroic act of grace and virtue and enlightened morality. But in a world where monarchs issue edicts and make decrees, where there is the rule of human beings rather than the rule of law, every age draws its spirit from the wings of a king or the queen. Joseph II's mother, Maria Theresa, only one generation before him, announced that I know of no greater plague than this race, which on account of its deceit, usury, and avarice is driving my subjects into beggary. Therefore, as far as possible, the Jews are to be kept away and avoided. And we all know who came to power only a few generations after Joseph II in Austrian land. When power resides in a single figure, peace can be possible. If the monarch is so inclined, but given time, malice will eventually come. If power is rooted not in laws, but in people, peace and dignity will depend on which people have power. Here in America, the biblically inspired Puritan and Republican imaginations understood that a binding constitution and the rule of law is the best way, if not the only way, to protect life, preserve liberty, and offer the enduring prospect of pursuing happiness. So Genesis ends with a celebration. Joseph and Jews could make it in Egypt. And in many ways, Pharaoh is the hero of the tale. Given a pair of prophetic dreams, he sees the Hebrew slaves' wisdom and gives them not only liberty, but power and respect and responsibility. And ultimately, when that Hebrew dies, he is buried in Egypt with high honors and dignity. Vayisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim. But this ending only moderates the message of Genesis for a moment. If we were to put the last word to music, it would be accompanied by an eerie and unnerving melody. It would suggest that the end of Genesis is not really an end at all, but merely the end of the beginning. Because the man called Pharaoh may be the hero of Genesis, but he is the villain of Exodus. We need the next book to complete the picture. We need the revelation at the core of Scripture. We need faith and the rule of law to bind us to our better angels and keep us from exploiting strangers. We need to divest people of absolute power, or someday we will all be cowering in fear. As George Orwell intimates, not in Animal Farm, but in his 1984, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Even though Joseph's story proves that peace and respect and prosperity is possible without the revelation at Mount Sinai, what follows suggests that without Mount Sinai, without faith in the rule of law, it is a peace and a prosperity and a respect that will almost unavoidably yield to evil. over time. So the end of Genesis is not only rhetorically artful, but a masterful finale crafted to teach us humility in the face of success and to drive home the enduring lesson that revelation is not only necessary, but the only path to lasting prosperity and a life of blessing. So as we turn the page and come face to face with the collapse of the Egyptian dream, let us embrace the gift of our collective revelation, which conscripts us into a covenant to hear each other's needs and listen to each other's dreams and redeem and heal each other's wounds, no matter how we feel. May the law that rules our lives spur and inspire us all to thrive forevermore. Shavuato.